The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I sincerely apologize about the 10-minute delay. We had some issues, technical issues related to GoToWebinar. But welcome. Thank you for being here this afternoon. My name is Savannah Bekowski. I work at the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center, and we have a great webinar set up for you today. This afternoon, we have options for small water systems considering regionalization. So a few logistics. Everyone will be kept on mute during the duration of the webinar. If you have any questions throughout the session, you can type it into the questions dialog box. We will be holding all the questions until the end for a Q&A. We will be posting a video recording and the presentation on our website, and you can reach that website in the bottom left URL. And you will be receiving an email that includes links to all of the material. We do not submit our webinars to licensing agencies for pre-approval of continuing education credits. We do provide certificates of attendance as a courtesy. It can take 1 to 2 weeks to send out these certificates of attendance, and you mustn't attend this entire webinar to receive one. We cannot guarantee that this webinar will meet requirements for a specific CEU or licensing renewal needs, but if you have any questions about this, you can email us at smallsystems@syr.edu. And for a little bit about us here, the EFCN program provides training and technical assistance to small public water systems in all U.S. states and territories. We have centers and partner organizations spread across the country for this year's programming, and we work together to create solutions for difficult how-to-pay issues of environmental protection and improvement. And on that note, I would like to introduce our speaker for today. We have Aaron Riggs, Senior Project Director at the Environmental Finance Center at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Aaron, I pass everything over to you.
Welcome. Okay. So is the PowerPoint on, Tess?
It is not on. You do have to share your screen by clicking the play button in the sharing section of the.
But I want to pull up the PowerPoint myself, is what you're saying. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry for the delay, everyone. We didn't have the prep time that we usually would. So, okay. Everyone should be seeing my screen now. Is that correct, Tess?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. As Tess said, I'm Aaron Riggs with the Environmental Finance Center at UNC. I'm going to quickly run through some of these slides since we're a little delayed, and I'm also going to provide one warning, which is just that, like many of you, I'm sure, I have 3 young children in the background that my husband is supposed to be keeping at bay, but if you hear children screaming, I apologize in advance. We're doing the best we can in these strange times. So we're going to talk about regionalization today. A lot of you provided some really great answers to things that you think about with regionalization and concerns you have, and talk sort of through some of the models and things that people consider, and then kind of talk about things that we recommend you consider or include in agreements when you're thinking of regional partnerships. So let's do the bad first. These are some of the terms that came when we asked what people think of with regionalization. These are more negative sort of associations with the term. Things like socialism, privatization, takeover, that loss of control and things like that. It does, regionalization and particularly consolidation, do sometimes carry with them these ideas of losing something. And we're going to talk more about some of these positive words, which also these phrases came out of the questions on registration too, thinking about the sort of new way of thinking and partnerships and increasing efficiencies and collaborating. So we're kind of all over the spectrum in terms of what we maybe came into this thinking about today, but we're focusing on thinking of regionalization as a variety of different agreement models beyond just consolidation, sometimes having consolidation of assets and services, but in general focusing on increasing cooperation and collaboration in order to sort of maximize efficiencies where possible. So why are we considering regionalization? Some of these challenges you guys identified in your registration questions, almost everybody identified something related to aging infrastructure. Obviously, we are all struggling with the costs associated with that and covering that in our revenues. Declining demand is a challenge, changing populations, and thinking of sort of some of the other challenges with limited capacity and those sorts of things. And then obviously, not that it's something that's positive as a new thing at all. The coronavirus in and of itself is a new challenge that we're facing. And for some systems, that was the only concern they listed. So that is something that we will talk about a bit today. It's obviously a new territory for all of us to think about how that's going to impact us as systems moving forward. So with all these problems, why are we talking about working together? So in general, we want to think about how many water systems there are in the country. As a whole, there's so many more water systems than there are electric utilities. As you can see, 155,000 public water systems with only 3,300 electric utilities. There's some challenges with having so many water systems and having so many folks trying to all be sustainable in their finances. In North Carolina, our home state, where we work very closely, just to give an example of thinking about sort of the differences in how all the systems are moving forward positively or negatively with their funding. We can look at the 2,000 community water systems in North Carolina, and you can kind of see how the bills are varied all over the place. And for those of you who use our dashboards, you can see in your own states how rates can vary. So there's not really a simple solution to figure out how systems can move forward, what those rates look like, and what revenue they need to be sustainable. And for those that are moving forward, there's a lot of challenges. In North Carolina, local government utilities in 2017 collected more than $3.04 billion in revenues, but the largest 10 utilities collected 43% of those revenues. So that means that a lot of those that you just saw on the map are struggling in a lot of ways. So the $2.43 billion in operating expenses, 22% of local governments had lower operating revenues than those expenditures, plus debt service. So not having a good operating ratio and struggling and trying to figure out how to move forward is a challenge for a lot of small systems. So this is just another visualization of sort of the challenge for systems in our home state, North Carolina. I know that the situation is similar in a lot of your states as well. Other reasons to consider regionalization, we're just thinking about the changes we're feeling from weather changes. We have the infrastructure challenges and capacity, with drought and the need for more water supply for growth. That's a challenge for a lot of systems that might be solved through regionalization. Obviously, emergency needs, we're experiencing a different type of emergency need right now, but we also often think about the emergency connections that are needed in times of having to turn our water off and borrow some from a neighbor. And then economies of scale is a great reason and a positive reason to think about regionalizing. So what are the options that we're talking about when we're thinking about regionalization? So I'm going to talk about 4 types of regionalization, but recognizing that we all collaborate in very different ways. In 2017, we did a utility management survey in North Carolina to just, and part of it asked how people are collaborating with other organizations. And some of these things I'm sure you're already doing at your system, things like sharing equipment or sharing staff with neighboring utilities. Some of these things are very organic that we do to partner, especially for small systems. We work with lots of small systems around the country, and we often see these partnerships emerging very naturally. They're not always formal and contractual, but they do emerge naturally a lot of times. And regionalization along those lines is a sliding scale. So it can range from sort of less formal conversations about the opportunity to partner and borrow your neighboring utility's truck, or it could be a much more complex formal creation in which you actually form a new utility structure. It's up to the parties, obviously, to decide how formal the agreement will be and how much partnering is going to take place. So the first type I'm going to talk about is sort of interlocal cooperation. In our state, we have 3 very distinct forms of interlocal cooperation, and from my work at looking at some of the other states, it's very similar. So you can either think about partnering and taking on something for another system. You're both retaining your independent legal authority, and you're just basically contracting to do something for the other entity. Another type is jointly, we both decide, the city and the county decide together that they want to take on an undertaking, and they're going to, again, retaining their individual legal authority, but agreeing to perform something collaboratively. And the third way you might partner would be to both delegate that legal authority and to transfer it to a new formed entity like a joint agency, and that joint agency would take on the undertaking. So that's 3 ways that you can partner from a contractual interlocal agreement. There's a lot of things you can do with an interlocal agreement, everything from agreeing to stop by your neighbor's utility to pick up their water sample and drop it at the same time as yours, all the way to actually creating a full consolidation through interlocal agreement. So and everything in between as well, sharing operators or just doing bulk sales. Interlocal agreements are a great way to partner with neighbors. Public-private partnerships are another regional option. That can be many things. Again, one could be full-on privatization of the utility. That was something that was referenced in some of your comments at the registration. So one of the organizations that we might think about would be something large like American Water. I'm going to talk a little bit later today about some case studies that we did for the U.S. Water Alliance on consolidation. One of them was the borough of Haddonfield that was consolidated into New Jersey American Water. And in that case study, you can see what that process looked like, sort of rate analysis that was done, what was needed to be taken into consideration for the borough to determine whether it was worth it for them to go ahead and sell their assets to New Jersey American Water, and sort of what transpired. So if you actually are interested in thinking about full-on privatization of your utility, and maybe it's time that you need to sell it, that's something that I would urge you to look at, because it does walk through sort of some of the financial and economic impacts of something like full privatization. You can also just contract out certain services to private entities. And one of the entities that works in our state, EnviroLink, is you could do something like they're doing for one of our towns near the Triangle, which is to go ahead and own and operate the wastewater treatment facility, and the town can contractually provide its discharge permit allowances, and then contract out to have that system have them run their system. So it doesn't have to be full transfer and sale of your assets and consolidating in. It can be just some simple contractual services. A third model of regionalization, and I'll just put this up here because it had very negative connotations in the registration form, is consolidation. And I recognize that that does carry with it sometimes a lot of negativity. But consolidation is also a spectrum when we think about this. There are multiple types of consolidation and levels of consolidation. Everything from direct acquisition, which we'll discuss here in just one second, all the way through just consolidation of certain government and operations and management aspects of your utility. So direct acquisition is probably the most traditional idea of what you're thinking of when you think of consolidation, a higher capacity utility fully absorbing another one in its entirety. And in that circumstance, like what I was just discussing with the borough of Haddonfield, the second entity ceases to exist in that utility form and is merged completely into that larger or higher capacity utility. A second form of consolidation would be a joint merger. This is when 2 or more utilities would actually come together and form something new. So in the joint merger, they actually do cease to exist as they were and create something new that is now A and B basically merged to form C. And so this is something, again, in our case studies in the resource that I'll reference at the end. This is an example in Arkansas is a great example of this that we do, looking at Little Rock and North Little Rock merging to form Central Arkansas Water, which is a really large and robust utility now in Arkansas. So you can see what that looks like to form something new. The balanced merger is a hybrid of the other two, in that you do have consolidation and sort of turning over of one utility or more utilities to another. But in doing that, you also have the creation of something new, which is a new governance structure that allows for board representation from those utilities, so that even though the entity as it was previously might cease to exist as an independent entity, it has representation on a board to help to dictate rate setting and the things that are important to the utility going forward. And then the fourth part would just be consolidation of certain services, operations, management, and that would be, again, more in line with something you would do in an interlocal agreement and not actually selling your assets, but just consolidating some of your services and sharing those. And the fourth type of regional model we'll talk about is just emergency connection. I think a lot of you probably have this already in place, but Emergency connections are just great ways for entities to be more prepared for emergencies, obviously, and to have backup resources for things that, as we're seeing right now during this COVID-19 crisis, water service is incredibly important right now. So we need to make sure we have emergency plans in place. So communities can contractually partner with each other to lay out those sorts of rights and responsibilities, making sure you have connections in place, or you can just participate in a WARN program, which many of you may already be a part of, this Water Wastewater Agency Response Network. So this is just going to be participating in an actual network in your region that you can coordinate these emergency efforts together with other utilities, and you can each WARN program can prioritize its own challenges, addressing sort of emergencies that are regional and would apply to those different entities. If you're interested in that, there's a link here to the video about seeing some of these WARNs in action if you're not already aware of them. But some of the benefits associated with joining a WARN, obviously you have that increased planning and coordination, you have that increased access to resources for small systems that might not otherwise have a lot of resources for sort of emergency planning. This is a great way to have that access to that information exchanges, and you can see sort of some of the things that you need in a crisis are going to be more accessible. And then also it's minimal obligation, and then each enhancement or each addition is going to enhance the likelihood of successful response. So in the case of an emergency, being a part of this WARN, you're going to have a more likely successful response to that. So I urge you to check out some more information on EPA's website about this if you're not aware of it yet. So things to consider when deciding on a regional option. First of all, you need to think about what sort of regional models exist in your state. Legality, I am an attorney by trade, but legality is obviously going to come into play in thinking about what you might be able to do with your utility to address your challenges. So in the models that we often see are sort of regional utility providers. As a county or a municipality yourself, you can provide regional services through different types of interlocal agreements. You can actually form consolidated utilities usually in your state. You might have authority models or joint management or power agencies that you can form. There's private regional providers, nonprofits, cooperatives, and then there's a lot of things that are like sanitary districts or metropolitan sewerage districts and things like that. Some of those may be less prevalent in your state, but it's worth digging in a little bit on the statutes and seeing what's there and what's legal in your state right now. When you're looking at the models, here's a couple examples from North Carolina. You want to think about how you want to evaluate the model, identifying sort of some of the pros and cons with each one. What is most important to you? If ownership of assets is very important to you and retaining that ownership, then you're going to want to look at a model in which you're not turning over, obviously, that ownership. A lot of entities are probably worried about what the rates are going to look like after. So thinking about rate equalization and how that's going to play into the partnership model. So this is an example of a single municipality operating as a regional utility. We have some large ones in North Carolina. This is thinking of something like a Charlotte. And you can see it's basically just allowing that local government utility to have far-reaching authority. One of the pros with something like this is that you can integrate sort of general city management planning and economic development into your utility operations, but it can be challenging when you have one regional provider to balance those sort of obligations for those outside of the jurisdiction of that one entity. So there are challenges with this one. There's other challenges to consider as well. But this is one way to kind of think about evaluating a model. A second model in our state that has been pretty successful is the Water and Sewer Authority. This is a special purpose unit of government. So it is a local government, but it has more limited authority. One of the most noteworthy limitations on its authority is that they cannot use taxes or issue taxes or general obligation bonds. And so that's limiting in the ability to move forward with certain financial capacity. But they have an appointed board. This is the only opportunity in North Carolina to partner county and municipality in a regional model. So if you're looking to partner with a jurisdiction around you, it's helpful to understand what's legal. Can you partner under certain models in the statutes? And to consider those options before you move forward. So these are two examples from our state. You would want to look in your own statutes or your own, or do a little research in your own state to see what models are available. The second, you want to think about what's feasible. Engineering studies obviously are going to come into play in the beginning to identify whether are you connected or do you need to be connected for the type of regional model you're looking at, and what are the sorts of associated costs or potential future financial scenarios associated with the regional option. Again, making sure it's legal, whatever you're thinking through. You're going to want to think about that in the beginning and check with counsel. And then also, obviously, this came up in some of the comments in the registration, which is that, you know, getting community members on board is often really challenging. You know, so from the very inception of your regional, you know, looking for a regional solution, you want to identify what the biggest concerns are from your community members and address those to make sure that whatever you're pursuing is feasible from getting community support. If you're transferring assets, you have to consider how you're going to value those assets from both a book value and a cash flow value. So considering that if you have an asset and you have debt out on that asset, when you no longer have the revenue coming in after you transfer it, how are you going to cover those debt payments? These are things to consider if you're doing more of a full consolidation model and transferring assets. Again, another comment that came up was concern about staffing considerations, which for some small systems is a huge thing. Thinking about whether or not your staff are going to have positions after some sort of regional merger is very concerning to folks. So these are some things to consider. You might need to harmonize different employee salaries and benefits from different utilities. What your neighbor is paying might not look the same as what you pay your employees. And so partnering is going to cause some challenges in that way that you're going to have to resolve. Again, sometimes with smaller communities, especially, staff wear many hats, and so they might be participating in non-utility services. What happens to that if you consolidate? Do you lose access to that staff person to do some of those critical pieces of your community's work? And then considering how you're going to address those challenges in a regional agreement. So a lot of this can be, you know, mentioned and addressed through successful contracts. And protecting your employees, if that's something that's really important to you, then you're going to want to sit down at the table during the negotiations and make sure that there's contractual protections for those staff members. The million-dollar question: what are your rates going to look like at the other side? As you should know, lower rates are not a guarantee with regional models, and even though that's maybe the end goal, I think, as a lot of you probably know, being utility providers, your rates are sometimes not where they need to be, and so they're going to have to go up no matter what. But they might be able to go up less if you can do a regional partnership that gives you more stability and more a pool of customers to spread the revenue out to. If you're equalizing the rates, what is that process going to look like? Is it going to involve surcharges or temporary increases? If you're merging or you're regionalizing with multiple utilities, it might look different for some of the utilities depending on the condition of the assets or what's happening at the time of the transfer. So it is a very important thing to consider. It's a very important thing that you want to make sure is transparent during the process. And so it's something that you want to communicate about from the very beginning and identify what that's going to look like. Again, thinking about if you're going to be forming something new, which is not necessarily always the case with regionalization, but if you're going to change the governance structure, how are you going to change it? Governance impacts every aspect of service provision. So this is going to depend on whether you're doing a full consolidation, how many utilities are involved, and sort of the service area and what it looks like. Thinking about how you both are, or all of you are anticipating growing or declining in your populations, and thinking of the health of the systems and the future regulatory costs. So there's a lot of pieces that are going to come into play with thinking about how you might want to consider a governance structure. If you're going to create, as part of your governance structure, a board, it's really important to think about who's going to get representation. And recently, in the last couple of years, I was able to do a research project to look at sort of the water and sewer authority models in our state, which all have boards. And North Carolina has been a state that's experienced a lot of growth. And not surprisingly, in those sort of contractual articles of incorporation, when they were forming these water and sewer authorities, they weren't really anticipating how they would address changing board representation should new communities come on and the water and sewer authorities grow. And that's something to consider. Where are you in the country? Are you experiencing a lot of growth, or are you experiencing decline? Should you consider changing board representation related to that? That's something to consider. Regardless, you also want to think about the number of board seats that you're going to provide if you're forming something like an authority. Does everybody get a seat? Do you base it on population? And then, so you want to think about the rationale for assigning board seats. And then think about what the rate setting process would look like and how, and making sure that you're communicating with board representation. You want to communicate to the customers that they have a voice at the table, so that it's one way to try to help customers feel more secure if you are going to pursue regionalization, is to think about making sure they understand that their voice will be heard and that there will be a decision maker representing them when it comes to rate decisions. Finally, in considering sort of the regional model that you might take going forward, you want to think about resolving disputes. So it's inevitable that there's going to be something that's going to come up that's going to cause some tension. So there's a couple of ways that you can approach this. Binding arbitration is one way that some entities approach this, and in partnerships, and it's often in contracts. We see it quite often, but it does have its downsides, because if you can't agree in the arbitration process, that binding arbitration does preclude you from moving forward with formal litigation. You could try instead maybe including something like a non-binding mediation and see if you can come to an agreement, but if you can't, you would at least retain that ability to pursue that formal litigation if necessary. It's not my favorite part of what to think about with moving forward in a collaborative way, but disputes do come up, and it's helpful to protect yourselves and to help you to have the most options for moving forward. So when you're actually moving forward in a partnership, you want to think about drafting effective partnership agreements. Each contract in general, just out of the common law, contract should include the parties, the responsibilities and obligations of the parties, and the duration and term of the agreement. As basic as that sounds, I look at contracts in North Carolina regularly that don't actually have all of these three requirements in them. So if you're looking at an interlocal agreement that you have with a neighboring system, or you're looking to expand one or create a new one, make sure you at least include those basic provisions. But that's really not enough. That's really not going to make it a really effective contract, and it's really not going to help you navigate how you move into the future together in a partnership. So first of all, you're going to want to identify whether there's requirements in state law for any sort of partnership model that you pursue. What sort of requirements are there in your state laws that have to be included in a contract? And then when you are otherwise going forward, you're going to want to think about, well, what are we talking about? If you're creating a new contract for the sale of water or wastewater services, there's a lot of different considerations that you want to think about. Again, thinking about the regions in the country where they're experiencing lots of growth, you're going to want to talk about what the current and future service areas look like, and what about that area in the middle that no one has right now, but that we probably are going to want in the future. You know, go ahead and talk about that at the time when you're creating your initial contract. Think about sort of anything from water quality concerns, or what about water pressure? What sort of pressure is expected in the flow? You could identify some of those things in the beginning. Are you going to be okay with reselling water capacity? And how will you handle sort of shortages in cases of emergencies or supply interruptions? These are all things that I'm sure you all address regularly: meter maintenance, key usage thresholds, you know, how much per day, thinking about being very specific, but they're very often not in contracts, and they can be, to make it a much more robust agreement. More considerations that are getting more into some of the weeds, but thinking about inflow and infiltration, which we recognize is a huge challenge for systems, especially small systems with very aging infrastructure. It's very hard to think about how to contract in language that can protect both parties with something like I&I. So there's ways to think about talking about it at the beginning. How are you going to address it? Is there a way to try to make it feel a little bit more fair, or to incentivize some advancing of infrastructure improvements so that it'll minimize I&I? You know, thinking about that at the beginning is a really good idea. Also just thinking about something like consideration of the challenges in collecting payment for wastewater systems. If the water service is from a different provider, you know, those sorts of challenges come into play with interlocal agreements. So these are all just different considerations. I'm going to reference a guide that we have at the end that we have put together that kind of walks through these and gives sort of sample language that we've seen that's been effective. But you know, creating your own list is also a great idea, to just think in the beginning of all the things that you want to make sure you cover before you sit down and actually negotiate an agreement. This is an example about meter maintenance, just thinking about ownership of meters, who's going to service the meters, and how it's going to be calculated in the event of a meter failure, you know, putting that in language. It's an example of something you'd want to do. Why so many considerations? You know, always the goal is to avoid unnecessary litigation. A lot of smaller systems in particular don't have staff attorneys or access to good legal resources. It's very expensive. So if it's in the contract, it at least gives you a starting point for moving through and negotiating. These contracts are going to be more long lasting if they're more robust in the beginning, and you can sort of reduce ambiguities. It's already on paper and we already talked about it, those sorts of things. And then it just also allows you to sort of expect the unexpected. So again, thinking about a situation like we're in right now, what can you contractually think about that would be really helpful, or that would have been really helpful right now? For you to understand, thinking about that going forward, if you were to pursue a regional partnership, what might be helpful that you weren't expecting at this time. So as a quick review, you want to cover in any good contract, you're going to want to cover who, what, when, and why, especially making sure that you include some sort of a provision for termination of the agreement or modification of the agreement. It's really helpful. And then for the how, thinking of all the different things in the middle, how it's going to be a successful partnership moving forward. So those are all the suggestions that we just went through. For some of the rural communities that are on this call, or rural states, you know, it might not always seem as much of, you know, regionalization has as many opportunities in some of the more rural areas, although I do think there's lots of great opportunities to regionalize. But you all face obviously unique challenges with the greater distances between your systems, have very significant infrastructure challenges, smaller tax base and political power when you're looking at some of the small systems in rural areas. But you can think about sort of how regionalization can be possible for your systems as well, and think about the ways that you can share the cost of equipment, services, and personnel. The emergency agreements, again, can be really useful, but also the small partnerships that you might create, just thinking about, can you write it down and put it in a contract to protect yourself? It's really for the protection of all the parties involved, but often we see systems that have been doing something a certain way forever, and the person who might have set up the agreement could retire and it's not written down anywhere. And it really just protects you in the future if you have it written down somewhere. So for whatever regionalization that you're utilizing in a rural area especially, make sure it's written down. Helping communities move toward these regional solutions. One of the questions or the comments that came up repeatedly was, like I said, getting people on board is a real challenge, and the people are not really interested in this. So one way that we've been approaching it at the EFC at UNC is thinking about what are the concerns that are the most challenging. Obviously, rates and what the outcome is going to be as far as how much am I going to have to pay after this is a challenge. But one of the other things that we really see often is that people don't want to lose their carrot. They don't want to lose their water system because they don't want to lose the ability to grow and to be able to bring in growth to their region. And so we've been working with some systems in our area, a very sort of challenging county in which half the county is growing substantially and half the county is not. And so we're trying to figure out the best way to help them regionalize, and everybody wants to hold on to that ability to annex and to grow. So one of the challenges they feel about moving into a regional partnership is that they will lose their ability to have annexed in new properties or new industries that might come to the region. So, you know, we address the concern right on, and I urge you to do the same. If you're hearing kickback from your citizens or from your customers and they don't want to partner, what is it that's the driving fear that they have, and help to sort of demystify that. With annexation in our state, We just kind of broke it down. There's nothing, there's nothing challenging. You can still annex in property. You can still get new tax benefits to your own individual community, even if your water is coming from a regional system. It's written right into the statutes. So we tried to break it down, make it very clear, and also just talk about reminding our customers and our ratepayers, remind them of all the things they might have to gain from a regional partnership. One being economic development to the region, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more from some of the case studies. Increased access to capital. You might be able to take out bonds that you were not able to take out before when you didn't have enough revenue coming in. You might be getting better water quality, larger capacity for systems that have agriculture. You'll have better water supply potentially. And then also reducing something else that was very important, reducing exposure to regulatory penalties. That's another opportunity. So focusing in for your customers or for your elected officials or your boards, focusing on all the things that they have to gain from the regional partnership is a great way to try to get them on board. Let's just talk about a few examples. This is the report I referenced earlier that we did for the Water Alliance. It actually goes through 8 communities that we did 8 case studies. I'm going to talk briefly about 2, but we focused on the financial benefits of consolidation. So this was specifically focused on consolidation models, but and they asked us to focus on the financial benefits, although we do address in the report, we do try to highlight some of the costs, because I'm not suggesting that there's not a cost associated with regional partnership. I know that there is, so we try to talk about those as well. But in general, these are some of the basic benefits that we were finding in these case studies and talking about. One of the first case studies that we did was Iowa, the Iowa Regional Utilities Association. The big driver in Iowa for these regional utilities associations, of which there are 19 in the state, is water supply needs. Again, talking about agricultural areas where there's a lot of need for water supply and consistent water supply. Something like a regional partnership might be a great idea. USDA was a big supporter and a promoter in that regard for these sort of regional partnerships. So they did have a strong partner in getting these sort of things off the ground. What the Utilities Association is a private nonprofit member-owned association, and they have a 9-member board of directors with the representatives coming from different geographic regions. The services that they provide drinking water and wastewater services. And so the funds come from the communities. Most of the communities have fully consolidated into the association, but not all. Some of them do just purchase wholesale, and some of them have residential customers or business customers that are separate. But in general, the flow of funds is coming from the communities to a central utility. And some of the impacts that we saw, obviously there's a larger revenue base to share costs. And the difference in Iowa versus looking at a larger revenue base at something that's like in the Northeast, obviously it's spread out a lot more. So you have to consider it in terms of what you're looking at, which is Iowa is very different. So the savings look different than when you're going to look at a very urbanized neighborhood. But you're seeing lots of spreading out of costs. There was an expanded water source and supply capacity for those systems, many of which really needed it. And then you're enhancing economic development opportunities in those rural communities. So that was really helpful. And the reason I chose to talk about Iowa is that one of the very specific questions that came in for the registration for this webinar was how do you get small systems to relinquish control? And that's a big challenge. We recognize, and we see it all the time in the systems we work with in North Carolina. But one is that you want to focus again on what they're gaining. First of all, being this sort of improved expertise and assets that they would not otherwise have access to. So in Iowa, that was a big emphasis, is focusing on what they would be able to access. But the second thing that Iowa did that was really helpful, even though it seems like a small thing, was to for a lot of the water towers for this Regional Utilities Association, they allowed them to retain their community identity. In some places, they actually put up new water towers, and then could put on the mascot or the name of the town. And although it seems like a small effort, it meant a lot to the town that otherwise, took a lot of pride in those water towers in the past. So relinquishing control is not easy, and making, you know, again, thinking of consolidation in terms of what you're losing is really challenging for systems. But if you can try to make it very apparent of what they're gaining, and especially thinking about economic development and the opportunity for growth and stability, you know, there are small things that you can think about doing that might make a big difference. And this is one of those, is the water towers. The other thing that you can focus on that it has a little bit more of a negative connotation, but just highlighting, is that the cost of staying separate can be significant. One of the jurisdictions that we talk about in the report that chose to not be a part of this Regional Utilities Association in Iowa was State Center. And so they went ahead and constructed their own small treatment facility rather than purchasing that wholesale water. And you can see the difference in their rates was almost $20 more a month, which for customers in small rural systems in Iowa is actually quite significant. So, you know, numbers don't always work and numbers aren't always available. You can't always show exactly how much you're going to be able to save your customers. But when you do have that information available, it's really significant in helping systems to understand that they need to relinquish that control. So the second system I wanted to talk about was Logan Todd, and this Logan Todd Regional Water Commission. So the drivers behind this this regionalization effort came in part from the Chamber of Commerce. They were having a lot of challenges with economic development in the region, and one of the member communities had actually lost this bid for a big poultry plant to come in because they couldn't meet the need for the potable water. So those two pieces were really significant for communities looking to have economic development in the region. The third thing that is also something to keep in mind when you look at your state and look at sort of some of the prioritization of funding that is available is that there was a strong preference for regional solutions from the funding agencies. So it gave them immediate points of prioritization if they were coming up with a regional solution. And that may be the case in your state, something to look at. So what this Water Commission is it's a joint powers agency, which we talked about a little bit at the beginning. This is 12 water systems together forming this joint powers agency. So they're delegating some authority to create a nonprofit. They're retaining individual ownership. So this is not like Iowa, they're not consolidating in, but then they're creating something new that can then take on some challenges that they had, which was creating a new water treatment plant. And they have a board of representatives so each of the communities has one member on this board of representatives. They provide wholesale drinking water from the plant that they were able to fund and put in place. This is from when we did the report. It's a little outdated at this point, but at the time we did the report, they were serving 52,000 with the potential to expand to 100,000. So they were able to fund and finance and put in place something that had built-in capacity for growing, which is also a really great opportunity. The partnership enabled them to attract the favorable finance that they wanted. If you want to look at the case study in depth, it shows all the different pieces of finance that they received and the interest rates. And that's what they used to finance the water treatment plant. Then, you know, they lost the poultry bid, but once they had their water plant in place, they were able to attract 2 aluminum manufacturing plants, which brought an unbelievable amount of economic development to their communities. And then they were able to have equalized wholesale rates for all 12 communities. So those are 2 examples of regional partnerships. I don't want to end this webinar without having an opportunity to address not the elephant in the room, but what we're all dealing with at this moment, which is why might COVID-19 make us even more interested in sort of regional partnership. So this is from last week's webinar. Some of you may have been on it, that we did on COVID-19 to try to address some things. The water systems, there was 136 webinar participants representing water systems. And as you can see, of those that answered, of those participants, 51% of them said that they have already suspended disconnections due to non-payment. So this is an impact that we're seeing that we can already see. This is how are your water revenues being affected by COVID-19? As you can see, most people, it's really too early to tell at this point, and that's not surprising at all. But what you can see is that 4%, which even though it's a small sampling, 4% are losing more than 20% that they can already see. And we can actually support that with some of the systems that we've already talked to in our state, in which they've just lost some really significant revenue contributors, and they are hurting already from this, and what will come beyond in the next couple of months, we don't know. So this is something to just think about. And the third one being, how long can you pay under these current conditions? And this I thought was pretty substantial, because as you can see, if this goes on for a long time, it's going to be really challenging for a lot of systems to be able to go forward and pay for their expenses. And so at some point, you're going to start seeing an impact on your ability to pay your debt payments. So what does this tell us? Although, this very early sort of a survey, there's still a lot we don't know about how this is going to impact our systems and our financial health. And then our already growing list of struggles is probably going to just get longer as a result of this pandemic, unfortunately. Our capital projects might have to take a back seat, and that's something that the funding agencies are already concerned about figuring out. Our debt payments might be impacted depending on how long this is and depending on how many days cash on hand we have. And affordability, which is already a challenge for so many of our systems, is likely to be an even greater challenge if rates need to go up. So these are things that we're worried about, and that we need to be thinking about how they're going to be impacted even more. But regionalization might offer an opportunity to share resources. Some systems right now in this crisis are experiencing staffing shortages. They might experience more staffing shortages, or because of revenue may not be able to have the same staffing capacity. It offers an opportunity to spread costs among a wider base, like we were just talking about. In smaller systems, as we know, they have less of a cushion right now. So thinking about how long this might go on, it might be an opportunity to partner with a neighbor and have a wider base to kind of get you back up to a really good stability for your revenue. It's an opportunity to build in the contractual help when needed. Obviously, I mentioned it earlier, we didn't really think that we would need to be planning for what to do during a global pandemic, but now we do. And so thinking about how we can partner or consider things going forward, even if you're just thinking regionally about how could we approach this and get ourselves more stable regionally, thinking about it in that way might be a good idea right now. And then potentially you might have more stability to continue to allow for economic development. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of businesses closing, we're seeing a lot of industries shutting down, and it's going to be a challenge to see what happens when we rebuild our economy after this. And so thinking about maybe making yourself that much more stable, you might have more of an appeal from an economic development standpoint. So regionalization is a great opportunity for that as well. So those are some things that I think are really helpful to think about. I hope that this was useful. I wanted to mention some other resources that are available to you. These are on our EFC website at UNC, and you'll have the slides from the presentation as well. But these are 2 guides that we put together that go way more in depth on some of the things that I talked about today, as far as crafting agreements and then thinking about the things to consider if you're looking at consolidating your system. The format of these guides, they're very living and dynamic guides. I'm trying to continue to update them by the different work that we're doing. They focus on the considerations, not telling you which way to go one way or another, but the things that you should be thinking about. And then sort of balancing examples and past practice with some of the new ideas that are coming out. And again, they're framed in the positive, but they're informed by some of the challenges and struggles that we've seen pretty repeatedly in our state and abroad and other places. Another resource is that consolidation report from the U.S. Water Alliance, and then there's a link to an interlocal agreement video. For those of you who are talking to boards or talking to people who need to help in the decision making, it's a great video to talk about the need for good interlocal agreements to be put in place. So think about how robust you should make your contract because of all the things that could come up. It's a 5-minute video, but it's really helpful if you have a board that you'd want to show it to or something like that. So I think that's the end of my slides. So I think Pastor, I turn it back to you.
So we can keep it up on that slide. We can, if you're ready, we can answer a few questions that we received during the presentation.
Sure.
Wonderful. Okay, so we received quite a few questions and a lot of comments. So for any questions that aren't that we can't answer right now online live, we will be following up via email. So the first one for you. For small rural cities and frontier communities, what entity typically introduces the idea of regionalization to the rest of the stakeholders involved? Are there key factors that help determine which is likely to be the most effective way to approach regionalization or consolidation concepts?
So that's a great question. I don't actually think that you can say that there is a norm for that. I really think it depends on the community. I think that the areas that we see, the rural areas in North Carolina, for example, it depends on who has the most sway. Is it one of the local mayors? Is it the utility director? You know, what hats are being worn by certain people? And in some of our small systems that we see in North Carolina, we see it coming from the actual utility. You know, the utility they have a lot of sway with their community, and they might be the right person. But it really depends on the political climate in your rural communities, and who you think is the voice that people would listen to the most. So I don't think it's a one size fits all sort of approach that I could say.
Thank you. All right, we'll do a couple more. So the next one, an attendee asked if you knew if any states forbid consolidation of water utilities.
I'm not aware of any legislation that has forbidden it. No, I know obviously there's only a few states that have, or California's approach of actually trying more of a mandated model. But what we have seen is a lot of uptick in the middle, more even toward that, which is just a lot of promotion of it. And then the biggest thing we see is actual, you know, is the funding agencies creating more and more of a prioritization, or even the state legislation creating prioritization or funding pools for money for consolidation. But I'm not aware of any actual forbidding of it. I think in general, the states that you would see that in would be states that would be wanting to protect the rights of those local governments. So I wouldn't think that would happen at the state level.
Great. And so for the last question, we'll do, from your perspective, do you have an idea if regionalization affects drinking water source contamination or pollution, so PFAs? And what pollution mitigation challenges and opportunities do you see before, during, or after regionalization?
Sure. So we have some contamination challenges in our state with this. I think that one of our strong regional utilities in the area has, I would say, just has a much more robust opportunity for testing for PFAS and PFOS as they've emerged. The impact on water quality and the contamination challenges or regulatory challenges, I think is significant. And one of the case studies we talk about in the Water Alliance report, you know, is just heavily driven by consent decrees with EPA that were the reason that the systems had to consolidate, because of the cost that it would be to come up to compliance. And we see that regularly. So to that extent, I think that consolidation or regionalization has a huge impact on the ability of those systems to come into compliance once they've actually partnered with other entities. As far as like the impacts on actual these sort of new contaminants of emerging concern, you know, I don't have any examples of direct impacts other than to say that the stronger regionalized utilities in our state are the ones that have had the more capacity to test, which the testing for the PFAS and PFOS has been much more expensive. So the testing that we've been seeing has been coming out of those more regionalized utilities. So that, you know, in my opinion, I think it's a great opportunity, regionalization, to improve regulatory compliance and to, in that way, you know, improve water quality. But I'm not sure exactly of the connection with PFAS or PFOS.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you so much for providing your expertise today and hanging tight as we had some technical issues. Thank you for everyone on the call today that hung tight with us this afternoon. So for any questions that we did not get to right now, we will be following up with you offline via email. And to close out today, I have one last poll question for you. The Environmental Finance Center does offer technical assistance for small water systems. If you would like to learn more and get connected with experts on some of these topics that we talked about today or other areas of expertise the EFCN provides, please let us know. And we'll get ready to close this poll in 3, 2, 1. And lastly, in that chat box, there is an evaluation form. We would love to hear how you felt today went. Your feedback is extremely beneficial to us. So, Erin, Thank you again so much for being here this afternoon. That was great. I'm going to throw it back to you for closing comments.
Yeah, I would just thank you all for being here and participating. I really would look forward to seeing the rest of your questions, and also urge you to follow up with our center as well. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me directly, and I would be happy to talk to you more in depth. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Okay.